Thank you, everybody, for joining me. I'm Kellie Peters. I'm a co-founder of Data Basics. And this month, I've decided to talk about artificial intelligence and data protection, in particular in relation to the guidance that's been issued from the Commissioner. So the discussion points are the ones that were on the registration that went out, is talking about accountability and governance, transparency, lawfulness, fairness as it applies to AI, and what steps to consider as part of a DPIA. So quick question for everybody that has joined me today. I imagine there is some type of AI that is being used within your organization, whether it be the tools that you have implemented. Can I get an kind of a quick snapshot from those in the group? How many of you are using some form of AI in your organization? Okay. Brilliant. I can see some. Hello, everyone. Brilliant. Okay, so we've got a kind of a combination of yes and not too sure. Some of you may also be potentially looking to implement and design your own artificial intelligence. So, like I said, this is coming at it from the guidance that's been issued from the Commissioner. I'm not an expert in designing artificial intelligence. I'm just coming at it from a data protection perspective. So, just to caveat that. But if you've attended any of my webinars in the past, you'll know that I like to set a bit of context, give a bit of definitions, because I think it helps set out for anyone that's listening to this afterwards where I'm coming from, and then we'll dig into the more detail of what we mean by what you should be doing with data protection and AI in your organizations. So what is artificial intelligence? So the in terms of the definition that's set out by the Oxford Dictionary, what it says is, as you can see on the screen, the theory and development of computer systems able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence, such as visual perception, speech recognition, decision making, and translation between languages. Note that the legislation itself does not use AI. It talks about automated decisions, but there is no specific in data protection at the moment to AI. If you look to Europe, Europe is looking to introduce particular pieces of legislation around AI. We're not quite there yet in the UK because our government is pro innovation, which could possibly be translated as not pro data protection, but that's a personal view, not necessarily shared by everybody here. So just to also let you know, the reason I keep looking up is I've got a screen behind me which has also got some useful notes for me. So if you and I have got at the end of this presentation the links that you might, and I encourage you to do some further reading. The Information Commissioner describes AI in two ways. It says that according to the research community, it refers to various methods using non-human system to learn from experience and imitate human intelligence. But from a data protection perspective, it states in its guidance, the theory and development of computer systems able to perform tasks normally requiring human intelligence. So you may already have in your organization, but may not necessarily be aware of it, types of AI that potentially are using machine learning, deep learning, or natural language. So you might be like, Kellie, what do you mean by this? So this is where I get to read some of my notes, just so I can recall it for myself. So machine learning is the process by which machines learn how better to respond based on a structured data or structured data sets and ongoing feedback from humans and algorithms. So it's very much it's learning through large volumes of data, and we're talking about thousands, and in some instances hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of data. Deep learning is slightly different. Deep learning is often thought to be more advanced than machine learning because it learns through representation, but data does not need to be structured. So machine learning is structured, deep learning not so much. So non-structured data could inform things like images, for example. And then you've got natural processing language, which is a linguistic tool in computer science, and it enables machines to read and interpret human language. So, yay. What does that actually mean? Do you have any examples? And the answer to that is yes, I do have some examples. And here are some examples where when you look at it, you might think, oh, hold up a second. Actually, I might not use that in the business space, but I absolutely do use it at home or in your car. So maps and navigation, such as Google Maps on your mobile phone. I know I use that. I don't use GPS in the car. I don't have a GPS tool. I use my phone. I plug in my phone. I type in where I'm going to go. And what that does is it uses machine learning. It will look at edges of buildings. It will interpret data that is coming from large data sets in terms of traffic and flows and stuff and whatnot. And hopefully will avoid me getting stuck in irritating traffic, which in Oxfordshire, you can get caught up a lot on the A34. Facial recognition and detection. Obviously, I don't know about you, but I have a mobile phone and I use facial ID to unlock it, for example. So for those of us that, unlike my mum, and I'm sorry, I'm shaming my mum on this, who has a very old Nokia phone and is not remotely modern, the majority of us on this call might be less like my mum and more like me with the mobile phone using facial recognition. But obviously, there are facial recognition tools out there that, for example, I think it was Sports Direct a couple of months ago that were caught out by using facial recognition to profile shoppers and to mark them on a system as whether or not they were likely to shoplift or not. So really not an appropriate use of facial recognition at all. Pretty sure they didn't do any kind of data protection impact assessment on that, but might just be my personal opinion of Sports Direct. Obviously, text editors and autocorrect. So you might have a tool such as Grammarly that you're using in your organization that is when it opens up in Word, it can help you with emails and it will look at the language that you're using. It will enable you to change different ways that you structure sentences and paragraphs depending on how you want to come across. And certainly we do on our website, we have a chatbot. So a chatbot uses algorithms and in terms of it will have set responses and depending on your responses, it will then take you down a particular route to give you an answer, for example. So quick question to everyone on the call. How many of you use any of these? Maybe not in work, but how many of you use at least one of these on a daily basis? Good. Okay, cool. Oh, marvelous. So there we are. We have a bit of exposure to the AI. So it's not new. I think that's the key message. So now I'm giving you a bit of definitions and a bit of background. What does this actually mean in terms of the world of governance and accountability? So for those of you that, and I'm sure you all are because majority of you have attended my webinars in the past, you'll know that accountability underpins the principles of the regulation in terms of fair, lawful and transparent data minimization, purpose, retention, security, and accuracy. So what accountability requires us to do is to be able to demonstrate how we are complying with data protection. And in this instance, how we are applying those core principles to our use and deployment of artificial intelligence and in our governance. How are we going to manage that use and keep managing the risks associated with that? So It's not enough to just say you do something, you need to be able to evidence how you do that. And certainly from an AI perspective, you'll need to be able to demonstrate um, what are the algorithms that are being used, how are the decisions being made, how, documenting that, and then being able to translate that to staff and to users. But let's go into that in a little bit more detail by what we mean by accountability. So, the law does require us to adopt a data protection by design and by default. So this shouldn't be an afterthought. So part of the reason I wanted to talk about some of the tools that are already out there is that some of these might have been implemented in your organization because they were snazzy, they were going to really help how you're going to work, possibly change your lives, and that would make work easier for staff. But did you consider data protection and this embedding data protection by design and by default before you implemented those tools? You don't need to answer that question. Typically, it is an afterthought and more likely to be one when you might have raised something to your data protection lead, data protection manager, data protection officer, and they've gone, hold up a second, I wasn't aware that we were using this. Have we done any kind of impact assessment? So what the data protection by design and by default looks at is from the very beginning, from the outset, before you implement anything from an AI perspective, let's take a look at what this means, what the risks are, how we embed this into the organization, into our system, what is going to be the impact of that. Um, and, should we really be going ahead with this? Because the answer actually might be at that very beginning no, it's too risky. So please, before you go ahead and invest in any kind of AI or before you start to design anything, if you are in that design R&D space, think privacy, data protection first before going ahead. That'd be my first plea. Um, Obviously, it sounds quite simple, but I think it is quite evident that this is not always the case. Is don't delegate accountability. So the responsibility of the design and implementation might very well be with the expert data scientists and engineering teams, but senior management, board, your data protection lead or officer, or head of compliance, whoever's responsible for data protection, must be involved in supporting this, because it shouldn't just be at the level of design, it should be permeated throughout the organization in terms of how do we evidence the support for this, how do we demonstrate we've done the necessary training, we've got the necessary policies in place, and that it isn't just the scientists that are looking at this and no one else really understands what's going on. So accountability should be across the board, and certainly from a risk perspective, it should be managed at the highest level with support throughout the organization. And hopefully that is the case where you work. What we've also got to do is, obviously, I've alluded to this concept of risk. So hopefully, and this isn't always the case, and I've gone into a number of organisations and I've asked for, where's your risk register? And they'll have something, but data protection won't be on there at all. So from your risk profile, update your strategy to include your artificial intelligence projects, especially if they're going to pose a high risk to individuals. So what do we mean by a high risk to the rights and freedoms? If the outcome of the AI is going to negatively impact an individual in terms of the options that they have available to them, maybe from a recruitment decision, because the way that the algorithm has been built has built in bias. And it's more leading to a particular individual getting a job rather than it being fair, then that could be a risk. It could be a risk to emotional or physical distress of an individual. And certainly the commissioner and the regulation do uh, indicate that AI is likely to have it's got a higher likelihood of an impact on an individual's rights and their freedoms. So it should be on your risk register. There should be an understanding of what are these risks really in terms of severity and in terms of impact, and what are the contingency measures we are going to be put in place, and are they robust enough? Because if they're not robust enough, again, you really should be considering whether or not you're going to take this forward. Now, I always describe myself as a bit of a data geek. So sometimes, as my business partner will say, I can get very super excited about data and I end up being at quite a high pitch when I talk about this as a subject. So when I talk about upskilling your upskilling your staff, it's if you've got a fantastic AI project that you're looking to introduce, implement, or create yourself, um, there could be the likelihood that you might speak in very technical terms that the users of that system, other staff, might not really grasp what it is that you're attempting to achieve. What are the algorithms going to do? How is this really going to benefit the organization and, more importantly, the individuals? So make sure that when these projects get into the R&D stage, or beyond that in terms of the development and in terms of the deployment stage, make sure that you have a plan about communication. If we think about transparency, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, we need to be able to describe what you're doing so that everybody has an understanding of that. So upskilling your staff shouldn't be a surprise as something that I'm telling you to do, and is in the guidance from the commissioner. So, quick question for everybody: in terms of any AI that's being developed, are any of you developing any R&D? Oh, sorry, are any of you developing any AI? Um, oh, okay, looks like it might be give that a moment. The reason I was just going to ask is, how is anyone else kind of looking to communicate to staff in terms of their use of AI? I suppose if you don't know, a good question might be to ask the question across your organisation: do we have any products that are using AI that we might not be aware of? Um, how is it being used in our organisation? So if someone should ask me, are there being any automated decisions made using this AI? You're in a better position to be able to answer that in a very simple. Oh, okay. So I think from what is in the chat, I think it's that. Well, how does everyone get a simple understanding of that, the product that's in use, and what is the role that AI plays in that? So if anyone is asked in the organisation, there is a basic understanding, not a technical understanding, but a basic understanding of the decisions and how it's used, and who to talk to if they have any questions. So that's the kind of high level accountability and governance perspective. But if we think about fair, lawful, and transparent, the transparency element is really about how are we going to be clear, concise, and informative so that individuals are aware of how AI is in use and how it is using their personal data. It shouldn't be by stealth. They should be very clear about its use. So transparency is very much about you must, like I said on the slide, consider your obligations to it. So your privacy notice or privacy policy, however you describe it, and it might, if I can get my teeth in properly, it may be that you have multiple privacy notices for different types of individuals. Look at that and those individuals and those privacy notices where you are using automated decisions, where you are using AI to generate outputs, for example, that have an impact on individuals that are using personal data, that you're clear in those privacy notices what's your purpose for processing that personal data. what is your retention of that? And this is not all of the requirements, but these are some of the ones to think about. Who are you going to share that data with? So once you've made a decision, do you pass that information on to any other third parties, for example? So who's going to be a recipient of that data? Consider, like I said, if you're having to be transparent about how you use AI in your organization and it uses personal data, remember personal data is name, location, photo, video, for example. How are you going to translate the technical talk of how your teams create and design the algorithms, or if it's not your teams, the tool that you're using and implementing? How are you going to explain those decisions that are made by that technology in your privacy policy or privacy notice in a way that someone is going to understand? So it's not in a way that the technical team understand. It has to be me as someone that's coming to your website and engaging with the chatbot, for example. How are how is my data being used and what decisions are being made by that chatbot for what purposes? Is that then being shared with anybody else? And make sure that's explainable in your privacy notice. And obviously, it has to be in a language that's easy to understand and accessible, because there might be individuals visiting your website where we need to be careful about the font size, for example, or it's how easy it is to understand what's being said. So it's not just about its understanding of it. Think about who you're writing that for. So that's your transparency requirement. So look at, I'd urge you to, after this, take a look at your privacy notices, read it from the perspective of the individuals whose data you're collecting, and check to see if you talk about automated decision making, talk about if there is any reference to the purposes that you're processing data for, where you're using AI. And if not, please go back and please update those appropriately. So it's no surprise that from the fair, lawful, and transparent, we talk about the lawfulness element of this. So when we talk about lawfulness, what we are, obviously there are 6 legal bases for processing personal data, and there are, if you're processing any kind of special category of data, there are a number of conditions that you will need to apply to that. So whether you train a new AI system to make predictions using an existing one, you have to have an appropriate legal basis. So you're not going to have one legal basis that covers everything that you do. So what are your purposes that you're processing that personal data for? And identify for each purpose the appropriate legal basis, whether it be consent or legitimate interest, for example. Don't assume that one basis is going to cover everything, because that is going to be incredibly unlikely, because there'll be different reasons and, again, a different justification. And don't just say legitimate interest. What is the legitimate interest that you're relying on for that data? Now, the guidance talks about and gives examples about when a legal obligation or performance of a contract, and think about if it is necessary for a performance of a contract, you need to be able to demonstrate that. Is it really necessary? Because if it's not necessary for that contract, then you can't rely on that. And does the law really require you to use AI or automated decision making? And if not, then you might then be looking at consent or legitimate interest, for example. But don't process the data before you've identified the legal basis for it. So don't start collecting it and then be like, oh, why are we collecting this? What's allowing us? What is the basis? Please don't do that. I'm going to assume that you don't. Document your decisions. So you might have a data map, you might have an information asset register, or you might have what it's referred to in the legislation as a register of processing activities. So as it says on the like Ron Seal on the tin, what are each of your processing activities? What is the legal basis for that? What's your retention and all of that? And again, in your privacy policy, have your purposes, and I would ideally have your purposes, and then alongside that, the legal basis that you're relying on for that, and you can present that in a nice tabular format. Obviously, if you are going to be using special categories of data, so if you are going to be using health information, so if you're creating an app that is going to be taking health information that is then going to be making decisions about where you're going to direct someone in terms of how it could help, for example, you need to have a condition for processing that. So what is the legal basis in terms of consent, legitimate interest, legal obligation, contract, and then what's the special condition? Is it explicit consent? For example, can you rely on the employment condition, for example? So do look at that, and you have to have that condition. You might, in terms of if you are developing AI in your organization, the guidance suggests that you have different purposes for your research and development to those that are in the deployment phase, especially as it may end up being deployed slightly differently from what you originally envisaged in the R&D stage. So think about all those different purposes in each of those different stages, and again, what is the appropriate legal basis that you are going to be relying on. And the guidance states that the consent may be the appropriate legal basis if you have a direct relationship with the individual. If you're not, if you're getting this through a third party, then you cannot rely on consent, because how would you demonstrate that it was obtained for a specific purpose, that they understood what they were consenting for? So you have to have that direct relationship. And I haven't gone into the other legal bases, but hopefully this gives you enough to start thinking about, well, what is that basis for us processing this data? And if you're not sure, go back to the teams or whoever's implemented this and say, why are we collecting this information? What do we collect it for? And what's allowing us to collect it? From a fairness perspective, and fairness permeates a lot through the legislation. Whilst it is part of the fair, lawful and transparent, it isn't just in this fairness element. You do need to consider it from the perspective of security measures you're going to put in, minimization perspective, and accuracy. So let me just flick to the next slide. So any processing of personal data using AI that leads to an unjust discrimination between people will violate the fairness principle. So one of the examples that was given in the guidance is if you use AI as part of the recruitment process, and the way that it is programmed is that it unfairly discriminates between men and women, with men given the greater chance of being put forward for an interview, then that is unfair to the female applicant. So you do need to look at the fairness component part of that. If you use AI to infer information about people, you must ensure the systems are statistically accurate and avoids discrimination. And that's not an easy thing to do, but you do have a responsibility to do that. So the principle of fairness appears, like I said, across the legislation, both explicitly and implicitly. So obviously it's quite clear in the fair, lawful and transparent principle. More specifically, fairness does relate to how you go about the processing and the outcome. So look at it from the outcome perspective and look up how is it going to impact on the individual? So the decision that's being made by that algorithm? What's the impact on the individual? Does it create any level of discrimination? And if so, that you are going to have to go back and look at amending that, or possibly not proceeding at all if it's something that cannot be amended for or changed. Obviously, or not obviously, it might not be obvious. It might not just be data protection. So rarely does data protection work in isolation. There will be other considerations that you need to think about. The one here is the Equalities Act. So think about it from the quite simply, I'm equality. Sorry, I lost my words then. Um, so, but it's not just the Equalities Act, because obviously you don't want to be discriminating against different races. You might also need to consider from the Financial Conduct Authority, where there is an expectation that you will treat customers fairly, and certainly that's the same for the Competition and Markets Authority. So you do need to consider the outcomes, like I said, of the legislation. So the other fairness, and I've just got to flick to the next slide before. Here we go. Oh, taking a minute. The other thing, which I've talked about already in terms of how does it affect other parts of the legislation, is that we've earlier talked about data protection by design and by default. So obviously think about the implication of fairness throughout that design and implementation of the AI. Think about, in most instances, you will have to do a data protection impact assessment. The fairness is part of the lawfulness and transparency principle. Are your purposes for collecting that data fair? How are you going to make sure that you only collect the minimum amount of information to be able to make the decisions that you need to make? How are you going to be able to demonstrate fairness from the retention perspective, ensuring that you only retain what is absolutely necessary in an identifiable format? How are you going to make sure that you implement appropriate and fair security measures when it comes to the data that you're processing? And we can't forget individual rights. There is obviously a specific individual right in relation to automated decision making and profiling. So you do need to bear these all in mind. Think about the fact that individuals have the right to be informed, which goes back to your privacy notices. So it is a very important concept that must be taken into consideration. Now, the other thing we've got is obviously the risk-based approach. I am very risk averse. I want to understand what is being collected, why it's being collected, what are the systems that are being used, is it using other data sources, is it linking with other data systems? So I really want to be able to understand the approach that is going to be adopted by us implementing this new type of technology, or us developing this new type of technology. So your DPIA, you should always be doing a screening form for these types of projects, and that will determine whether or not that it will go ahead. I would try and be as agnostic as is humanly possible, because obviously if you are the data scientist or the project manager leading this, you are going to be very pro implementation of this, but please try and consider it from a holistic perspective. It is unreasonable for us to think that you're going to have a zero tolerance for risk, because that's just not the way or the world that we live in. But you do need to make sure that your DPIA has considered all of the risks, your legal basis for processing, the security measures, your retention, your transparency with individuals. Is it reasonable that individuals will expect you to be processing their data in such a way? And then once you've identified those risks and you've determined the impact and the severity, what are the mitigations that you're going to put in place to reduce the risk of that happening? You're never going to, you may be able to remove the risk in that you simply don't process a particular type of data because it is too risky and then there are not sufficient controls in place. It might be that the DPIA outcome is that you don't proceed. And it's about making sure that if the decision is to not proceed because it's too risky a project, that you don't. Because if you ignore the outcomes of the DPIA and you proceed and then those risks become realized, you're going to be in a little bit of hot water. Always think about the risk of the individual. It is their data. They do have the right to know how you're processing their data. So and like I said, the guidance is very clear. It is highly likely that you'll have to do a DPIA. So it won't just be enough to do the screening form. You will have to do the full assessment. So do consider, and this is again, do consider if the your AI project R&D tool that you're looking to introduce is systematically monitoring publicly accessible areas. It might not be on a large scale. Are you processing large scale of special category data? And is there any kind of systematic and extensive evaluation of personal aspects based on automated decision making? And there are lots of cases out there where it is brought into question the use of, for example, facial recognition and how that's been negatively implemented because risks haven't been considered. And again, there are risks that we do need to consider in terms of the impact on individuals. So an example of an allocative harm is an organization may use an AI system in recruitment that disproportionately classifies applications from male candidates compared to women, like I said earlier. The use of this system has implications on the allocation of job opportunities for female candidates and the relevant economic results. And a representational harm example is an individual belonging to an ethnic minority group uploads a picture of their holiday photos onto an internet platform. The image recognition system operated by the platform signifies and assigns a label of their selfie that is degenerating and reflecting racist tropes. So, you do need to really consider the impact on the individuals, both from discrimination, emotional distress, possibly financial harm if there's a risk that they won't get a job because of the algorithm that has been built. So individual rights and freedoms are likely to be impacted by an algorithm. So that's everything that I really wanted to cover, and I am shortly running out of time. But I also, and before I open it up to questions, and feel free if there are any questions to type them in the box. I've got a couple of slides where I'm going to be talking about some additional reading. So I've done a real high level overview of AI and data protection. There is additional documents out there which I would urge you to read. The two are explaining decisions made by AI, which is really useful because it splits it out in terms of what you need to think about from a DPO perspective, what you should be thinking about from a technical perspective, and then the guidance on AI and data protection. So do keep an eye on this. And obviously my focus has been very much about what the UK guidance is, but I am going to assume a lot of you are not just UK focused. If you are UK, Europe, or UK and the globe, you do need to keep an eye out on what other countries are doing in terms of their AI potential legislation that is coming in. So do keep an eye on it because it is an evolving subject at this moment in time. And obviously I encourage you to keep an eye on the ICO website. So that is everything that I really wanted to cover today. So I got a fly in front of me. Any questions? And if there aren't any questions, I at least hope it was helpful. If you want a copy of the slides, I'm more than happy to email anyone a copy of the slides if they want them for reference. Like I said, the website, not the website, this is being recorded and it will be made available on our website and our YouTube channel on Monday. So I can see some typing. So I will. Okay, brilliant. Can you just type yes if you'd like a copy of the slides, so I know exactly how many of you want a copy, so I can send them to you. Cool. I do hope that was helpful. I'll make sure that you'll get a copy of the slides. It will be Monday, if that's okay for everybody. But if there are any questions, then that's quite cool. Feel free to message me. You've got my email address from this invitation. I hope you all have a very awesome rest of today, wherever you are, and cool. I can have a good rest of today. And if you any of those that want to shoot off, you can do. I've got a question. There are several solutions available in the market that offer insights into purchasing behaviors. Should we be asking these solution providers for? Yes. So so Richard's asked a really good question. So you shouldn't just be asking the provider what are their purposes for processing. You also need to consider what your purpose is for processing. So if you're going to be using their systems, what is your purpose going to be? And certainly of those providers, I'd want to have sight of their DPIA if they are prepared to share it with you, or at least talk you through it, because that would be something I'd be really interested in. Is like, if you're using this, you should have done a DPIA. Can you tell me what the risks are? How have you mitigated against any of those risks? What are their purposes? And then if you're going to start purchasing that system for your own purpose, you need to consider the same types of from a risk perspective. And also you're going to want to have a contract in place with that third party. I hope that's helpful in answer to that question. If not, I'm happy to have a conversation offline. So it is almost time to go. So like I said, have a great day.